back to the Neurosense podcast, where we make neuroscience make sense.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Shelby.
And today we're tackling the topic of poverty and brain growth.
And if you've ever listened to our podcast before, you know that we always start with outlining a target audience.
Yes. And today we're targeting policymakers.
So like politicians or anybody on Parliament Hill that happens to be listening to us.
Yes. And we want to target them because today we're going to dig deep into the relationship between low socioeconomic status or poverty and the outcomes for executive functioning and the way that relates to your prefrontal cortex development.
Ooh, super tasty.
Yes.
So I'm going to start us off with some definitions. Socioeconomic status, or as we will be referring it to, SES, is an index of your economic resources and hierarchical social status. So basically that's measured by income, education, occupation type, among other things. And low SES is generally what we refer to as poverty. So it's a spectrum.
In terms of executive functioning, what we mean when we say executive functioning, we're referring to things like your ability to hold things in working memory, your attention, your ability to inhibit behavior or thoughts, make decisions, plan, organize, set goals.
So basically what you're telling me is like executive functioning is all of these adult qualities that we think of. The big things that differentiate adults from like teenagers.
Exactly, that's very well put. And basically executive functioning development relies on the healthy development of your prefrontal cortex, which is the sort of forefront of your brain, and it takes the first sort of 2 to 3 years of your life to develop, so it's a very slow sort of progression.
Decades. Not years.
Decades.
It's a long progression, which means there's a lot of opportunity for environmental intervention. So Sarah, what do we know about poverty and brain growth?
Yes, thank you, Shelby. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that low socioeconomic status is related to impaired executive functioning in adulthood. So to start off, Hackman and Farah in 2009, they did a sort of meta review of a bunch of different studies looking at the relationship, and they found that those who were in low SES in childhood did show signs of reduced executive functioning in adulthood. And this was looking at behavioral and physiological studies. So they really looked at both the behavioral output and then also the physiological stuff going on in your brain. So they tackled from a lot of different angles on this. A little bit more recently, Lawson and colleagues in 2013, they found that low SES in childhood was associated with actually a thinner prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the sort of area of your brain that's in charge of your executive functioning. And the fact that it was thinner is relevant because in childhood, we expect to see a thicker cortex, and that's because when you're born, you have many more neurons than you'll ever have again in the rest of your life, and really a lot of connections as well. And this is important because this is what allows children to sort of develop in accordance with the environment that they're in, and then any of those connections or neurons that they just don't need will just kind of be pruned away, and then their cortex will thin out over the course of their life. But if we're seeing in these low SES children that they're having a thin cortex to begin with in childhood, that's an indication that there's some development that hasn't happened quite the way it really should be happening.
Okay, so like what kind of social implications does this have?
Yes, so a really cool study coming from Caspi and colleagues in 2016, so very recently, they followed a group of thousands of people over the course of 40 years in New Zealand, and they found that there was a cohort of about 20% of the overall population who were characterized by sort of low SES types of things in childhood. They were accounting for around 80% of the economic burden in adulthood, which is insane.
That's crazy.
Hugely disproportionate, of course. So they were relying heavily on things like welfare and healthcare benefits, and they were disproportionately representing the crime rates. Pretty significant relationship, I would say.
Yeah, I would say so. And I also would like to just kind of like point out here that it's really exciting that this has been found in New Zealand because their social system is so similar to ours in terms of how they do social support and like welfare and healthcare. It's very much the same as our system. So like this study has really important implications for like how we are running our society.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think this brings us really well into what we don't know about brain growth and poverty. So I think that we can all agree here that there is a relationship between SES and executive functioning. But it's really important to note that we can't really say for sure that this is a causal relationship. So the number one thing that all psych majors learn in their first year of psychology is that correlation does not equal causation. What that really is to say is that there's a super solid way to design a study is to randomly assign participants to two different groups and then have the only thing that differs between those groups be the condition or the thing that you're looking at studying. So in our case, the thing we're studying is poverty. We can't randomly assign people to poverty versus not poverty groups. Like A, unethical, B, just not feasible. You can't do that. So because we literally cannot study or look for a causal relationship and we're exclusively dealing in correlations, we can never really say for sure what the nature of this relationship is. So we can't rule out the possibility that, say, low SES and executive functioning are caused by some unknown variable. So like, for example, genetics potentially causing an executive functioning deficit, which then creates lower SES in life. Or that they're indirectly related to each other through an unknown third variable. So for example, stress, which could be caused by a low SES environment in childhood that then inhibits your prefrontal cortex development and then later in life inhibits executive functioning. Yeah. So really, we don't know what's going on, right?
Not really.
So Sarah, what does this mean?
Yeah, so without knowing the nature of the relationship, it makes it difficult to really target interventions in early childhood. We can try to alleviate stress, for example. Maybe stress is the thing that creates this relationship between poverty and executive functioning deficits. So we can try that, but we don't know for sure that it's going to work because we don't have solid evidence on the nature of the relationship. In terms of what we do know, is that whatever the nature of the relationship may be, it's very clear really that if you are growing up in poverty, which is for whatever reason creating executive functioning deficits, that's actually setting you up to perpetuate the poverty cycle. It's setting the person up to stay in the cycle of poverty, because if their executive functioning things like decision making and planning and organization and inhibition, if these things aren't working properly, it would be difficult for them to hold down a job or to get a job in the first place or to make good decisions in terms of, crime or making, having a family and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And that can, of course, just lead back into that poverty cycle. So it's not ideal the way it is right now.
Right. So that kind of leads us into what we still need in terms of research on this type of thing. So as said earlier, research is really limited to being correlational here. Which really means that intervention programs can really help us study the relationship between SES and executive functioning. So implementing programs like, improving education casually, or like creating universal basic income, little things like that. It could really reduce things like stress in childhood environment. And this is, of course, where our policymakers come in, because it's really up to them to put these types of policies in place. But that also indirectly is our problem too, because we live in a pseudo-democracy where like our vote actually matters. So like, put your vote where your mouth is, right? Yeah. So that it's really not to say that because we don't understand the relationship between SES and executive functioning that we can't do anything about it. It's absolutely reasonable for us to implement these types of interventions because they're so not negatively impactful. Like there's only positives that could come out of these types of interventions. So why not give it a try?
Absolutely.
Right?
I agree.
Okay, so with that, let's get into some myths and facts about poverty and brain growth.
Let's do it. I'll start with myth number 1, which is that poverty is only the problem for the impoverished.
This is completely everyone's problem.
Totally.
So if you remember what we talked about earlier with that Caspi article, 20% of the population who are living in poverty throughout childhood are responsible for 80% of the social burden of cost. That's insane. A big freaking deal. Yes. Right? And when I say social cost, I mean taxes. I mean the money that you are investing with your income taxes into healthcare. Yeah. And welfare. All of these welfare and all of these social constructs, all these social systems that we have in place to help better society. So, if we just spend maybe a little bit more money on child interventions, it could potentially offset this huge social burden that we're seeing with individuals raised in low SES.
Totally.
Right.
So it's an everyone problem.
It is definitely an everyone problem. Yes. So our next myth is that low SES is a predetermined path.
Yeah, this is not true. Firstly, we don't know the nature of the relationship, so it would be ridiculous for us to say that if you're poor, you're going to be poor because it's, that's not true. But beyond that, even if we were to find something like let's say we found that there was some genetic predisposition toward reduced executive functioning, which then maybe leads people to poverty. Even if we did find something like that, we know in neuroscience that your genes do not equal your destiny. No matter what happens, your environment is always going to be interacting with your genes, and that means there's always opportunity for us to intervene in the poverty cycle and help people get out of it.
So that's epigenetics, by the way, in a nutshell.
Epigenetics.
We're just not going to get into that today.
No. And then, so to go into our last myth then, our last myth is the idea that eliminating poverty is the answer.
So while this would be an ideal situation, obviously poverty sucks.
Yes.
It's obviously not, it's just not going to happen. We can't just say, all right, that's it, poverty's done. We really just need more evidence. Like, we're just bringing it back. We just need more evidence to tease apart these factors that are like causing this impact on executive functioning. And we can do so by implementing interventions to help equalize the playing field for kids who are raised in low socioeconomic households. So we really just need to like spice up the education system, make it more well-rounded, or try funding after-school programs to keep kids active and engaged, and maybe reduce some of the stress that could be a side effect of living in a low SES household. That's all the time we have today to talk about this topic, unfortunately. I mean, we could probably go on for hours and hours about this.
Probably. That's so poverty and brain development in a nutshell.
It really is. So if you want to hear more about poverty and brain development, or any topic whatsoever that we might be talking about, you can check us out on iTunes or anywhere you get your podcasts.
If you know anybody who's a policymaker or who is in politics in any way, please pass on this podcast. We really do want to get these thoughts to them as much as possible.
Absolutely. And so again, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed Neurosense.